Rafael McDonnell is Communications and Advocacy Manager for Resource Center, the GLBT Community Center serving North Texas. He has successfully participated in community advocacy for GLBT employment protections, impacting nearly 50,000 public sector employees in North Texas, along with partners benefits for employees of Dallas County and Dallas Area Rapid Transit, DART. McDonnell has also advocated for anti-bullying and non-discrimination policies covering more than 250,000 students at Dallas ISD, Dallas County Community Colleges, and Uplift Education. His 25-year career as a professional communicator includes working at radio and television stations in Dallas, Houston, and Oklahoma City. Prior to 2008, he worked in the news office at UNT and participated in UNT's Ally program. Will you please welcome Rafael McDonnell?
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank the members of the Dallas Way, the board, and so forth for inviting me to be a part of tonight's presentation here at UNT. When I got the invitation, I was asked to talk a little bit about some of my time here at UNT, and to be honest, there's not a whole lot of LGBT stuff I can say about it. I earned my master's degree here at UNT, was on campus from the fall of 1997 and then all of 1988, and I was not out. I didn't really participate in anything. I was still trying to work through what it meant to be a gay man, and saw various images on TV, heard various stories, and I would not be fully out for another 2 years when I was in my first job in Oklahoma City. So I really don't have a whole lot to say about LGBT life here in Denton back in the 1980s. In trying to come up with what I was going to talk about tonight, I decided I was going to look at really two different parts of my life. As Robert mentioned, I was a broadcaster for a number of years. And to be exact, in radio, I worked from 1988 to 2000. So 11 years in radio. 9 of those were full-time, 2 of those were part-time. The vast majority of that time was at KRLD Radio here in Dallas. Started there in October of 1990 and left in November of 1996 as a full-time employee, and returned part-time in March of 98 through March of 2000. And in that time, I started off not being fully out in the workplace, but by the time I left, I was out. So along that trajectory, I got to witness a number of things in my career. A couple of them are some interesting stories. I do want to kind of mention that my very first day on the job, I had a reporter on the staff of KRLD come out to me, a man by the name of Brian Shields. Brian is a UNT alum. He worked at KRLD for most of the 1980s up until 91. We only worked together at KRLD for a matter of months before we had a layoff and he was let go. He is now the online news manager of KRON Television in San Francisco. And someday, if you all are able to do presentations like this via Skype, he has some really interesting stories. He covered DISD during the Nolan Estes days. He covered City Hall when Bill Nelson was running for office. I think he'll have some interesting stories if we're ever able to have him tell some of those. For the first 3 years or so of my career, I had one boss. For the last 3 years of my career at KRLD, I had 6 bosses. And during that first part of the career, I got to do a story that, or work on a story that is probably one of the things I'm proudest of as a journalist. In 1993, we had a March on Washington for LGBT rights. Many folks have heard of that, seen of it. My boss, CC Cox, who was here last month, even did a photographic book on it. On the return from the march, it was a bit of a controversy that erupted involving locally based American Airlines. It seems that on a flight back from DC to DFW, The pilot on board the plane decided that all of the pillows and blankets, yes, back in those days you actually could get pillows and blankets on airplanes, needed to be removed because they were gay activists on board. The mistake he made was actually telling somebody that and putting that in writing, because that word got out. And that word ended up getting out to David Taffet, who some of you know is a reporter for the Dallas Voice. At the time, he was the vice president of the Dallas Gay and Lesbian Alliance. And David decided to blast fax every station in town about this. I immediately saw it and thought, hey, there's a story. So at the time, we had a newscast at 6 o'clock where we were allowed to have longer stories. If you listen to stories on the radio, if they go 45 seconds, that's too long. But in this particular 6 o'clock newscast that we were doing back in '93, we could do stories that were a minute and a half long. Ooh. And so I thought, this is a great story. So I had our afternoon reporter, a woman named Donna Allday, she has passed on since, call American Airlines, let's try and find out what they say. And I'll take the gay angle. So who do you think I called? The most visible gay man in Dallas, John Thomas. John was great with quotes, always available, and I remember earlier that year he had kind of blown my mind because there was an incident involving Barney Frank and the former congressman from here up in Denton, Dick Armey. Dick Armey had made a slur about Barney Frank, and so of course I called John Thomas for a reaction, and he said, well, I'm a gay Republican. As a 25, 26-year-old reporter, partially in, partially out, the fact that there were gay Republicans really surprised me. Nevertheless, I got through that interview. So anyway, I called John and did the second part of the story, and Donna did the main part of the story with American. So we got the facts about 4:45. We had it on the air at 6. By 8 o'clock, the story had gone national. We were the first station to actually carry it. Bob Wittick, who is a veteran PR person, specifically in dealing with LGBT issues, has cited this particular incident as kind of being the watershed moment that turned around how airlines and businesses, more particularly, treat LGBT employees. They went from this incident to actually form an LGBT employee resource group, which is now 25 or so years old. They started non-discrimination policies, partner benefits, trans health benefits, and so forth, and have been consistently 100 ranked on the HRC Corporate Quality Index. And it all started because a pilot made a comment that he shouldn't have made, and somebody wrote it down. And I just happened to see a fax and go, hey, there's a story. Another story from the radio career, I've titled My Breakfast with Flip. You probably remember there was an art movie back in the 80s, My Dinner with Andre. This is not like that, I should tell you. The name Flip, to folks of a certain age, my age and probably older, can only mean one person, and that would be Flip Benham. Flip Benham was a minister here in Dallas who later headed the group Operation Rescue, an anti-abortion group. It has since morphed into a group called Operation Save America, which they now hate LGBT people as much as they hate people having abortions, and is based in North Carolina. His name has come up in the news recently because his two sons have starred in a show on, I think it's HGTV, which had generated a number of protests because of their views. They share many of the same views as their father. Anyway, the BBC had contacted me because they wanted to do a story with Flip Benham about some particular anti-abortion activist in Great Britain, somebody that I had never heard of. And they said, we'll pay you $100 to sit down and talk with this man for 20 minutes. Sold. Radio people don't make much money. And so I have to sit down with Flip Benham and do this, I'll do it. At the time, Flip Benham was at the Dallas City Municipal Court building, that's the building kind of on the east side of downtown. It looks like a classical city hall, which it used to be. And he was there paying some kind of a ticket or something for some kind of civil disobedience action he was engaged in. And so I met him there, and he said, hey, why don't we get some breakfast or something before we talk? I don't know about that. So I just said, I've got to get this interview. I've got to get this interview. I've got to get this interview. And so we went across the street. It's now the Hotel Indigo, a nice little boutique hotel, but at the time it was just a hotel. I can't even tell you what it was. And we went and ate in the coffee shop of this particular hotel. And he was as kind and pleasant, as normal as anyone you would ever possibly hope to imagine. You know, there were no horns growing out of his head. He was, we talked about family, we talked about, vacations, we talked about all sorts of stuff. And so then we finished our little breakfast and we went back across the street, and just in one of the hallways there, while he was waiting for his court appearance, we taped the interview for BBC. And it was like flipping a light switch. He put on the voice, he put on the rhetoric, and I was just creeped out. A few weeks later, I got my lovely little $100 check from the BBC. I couldn't spend it on myself. I just thought, this is just creepy money. I can't do this. I ended up donating the money to a group I was a member of, Dignity, which is a gay Catholic group. I'd been a member of it since '91 and served several terms on their board and a couple times as vice president. And so I just donated it to Dignity. I thought that, Flip Benham just basically gave us $100 for our snack fund and other liturgical fund. So I just couldn't keep the money. So those are just a couple of the stories from the broadcast career. Two quick stories from my more recent career at the center. You, of course, last month got to hear from my boss, C.C. Cox. Wonderful woman, great boss, truly a fearless woman. Except when I come walking into her office and say, "Hey boss, I've got an idea." I really think she just briefly swallows for a moment and steels herself for whatever thing is going to come flying out of my mouth. And some of them have been, easy to shoot down, I'll admit that. Some of them have just been trial balloons, and some of them I've been able to make the case, and we've been able to pursue them. And the two that I would mention, I think, tonight, and there are so many others for other times. The first one I'd mention is what we euphemistically refer to as hell freezes over. In the summer of 1990, the fine folks from the Westboro Baptist Church decided they were going to come to Dallas-Fort Worth and protest. I don't know why, maybe they got a good deal on some hotels or airfare or something, but why not spend part of your summer in DFW? And one of the locations they decided to protest was Congregation Bethel Manah, which is a Reformed Jewish congregation that has met at Resource Center for years. So we were talking about what kind of response do we want to have to these folks. The community was saying, well, we need to do something, we need to do something, we need to do something. And so I just kind of decided, I'm going to go look on the internet. Let's see what's going on out there. And I saw several groups had decided to turn protests of the Westboro Baptist folks into fundraisers. We're a nonprofit. We love fundraisers. Fundraisers are our lifeblood. If we don't have fundraisers, we close our doors. So I thought, okay, let's find something that we can raise money for. And lo and behold, something happened. Our ice machine broke. As many of you know, Resource Center, one of our longtime programs is that we provide a hot, nutritious lunch to our clients who are HIV positive, about 100, 150 lunches or so a week. And part of that is that you need to have ice for your tea or your Kool-Aid or your water or whatever. Our ice machine broke, and we were actually ending up at the point having to truck in ice from some of the bars that Cabin had. And that was just a temporary solution. This was, the dreaded words that you hear, unbudgeted expenses. That's what the ice machine was. It was unbudgeted expense. So we were going to just have to make do with this ice machine situation for a while, until the Phelpses decided they were going to come to the center. And I said, let's do a fundraiser to raise money for an ice machine. Cece looked at me like I was crazy. I will say that. She kind of said, what? And I said, oh, trust me, this is a good idea. And she said, okay, well, you do this, but we're not going to spend any money on it. figure out how you're going to do this, and we're not going to spend any money on it. And I said, well, we need a catchy name. And I just kind of thought ideas. I said, we're going to call it Hell Freezes Over. And that's what happened. We went and launched it via social media. People picked it up. The day of the protest, it was raining. We still had several hundred people in our front parking lot. We had people running around with garbage cans that people would just throw money in there as long as the Phelpses were out there. Singles, checks, change, whatever. We had groups that showed up with large checks of their own. By the time the fundraiser ended, we had raised $11,000 and spent nothing doing it. I can't really say we spent nothing. I think I went and I bought some off-brand Fig Newtons at Kroger out of my own pocket. So I think the net cost was $3, but I absorbed that. So because they were one of the things they were talking about is that God was looking for good figs, and so we said, hey, we're going to serve some. So nothing like off-brand Fig Newton cookies as refreshments for your protest. The other story that kind of fits under this umbrella of, hey boss, I've got an idea, has to do with a certain large Fortune 500 company based here in North Texas that has been fairly resistant to calls to equality, and that's ExxonMobil. About a year or so ago, some of the details of the story came out in a piece that was on the cover of the Advocate magazine, but there's a little bit more to this, so I want to kind of fill in some of the blanks. You probably know that ExxonMobil has been not exactly LGBT affirming and welcoming. I think the last HRC score had them as a -25, so not really high. In 2011, in the fall of 2011, we had a listening session at the Resource Center that was hosted by a man by the name of Gautam Raghavan. He used to be the liaison to the LGBT community from the White House. He now works for a foundation out in Colorado, but at the time he was the liaison, and there were several members of the community from across Dallas-Fort Worth who were there as part of this listening session. And the topic of ExxonMobil came up, and the fact that they weren't going to do anything until the federal government put pressure on them. Jack and George, who all of you will know here, who have been valiant parts of the Dallas Way, came up to me after the meeting and says, we know how you can reach ExxonMobil. Really? And so they encouraged us to write a particular board member that they knew her daughter. So we wrote the board member. Didn't hear anything. Doing a little more digging, found out that the company had a new vice president of human resources. We wrote him. About a day after we wrote him, we got an invitation to come meet with Exxon. It took us 6 weeks to get the meeting. But we finally got a meeting in the last part of June of 2012. ExxonMobil, you may not know where it is, but I'll tell you where it is in case you're ever driving past there. If you're looking down 114, driving west from the old Texas Stadium area out towards the airport, look to your right about Walnut Hill, MacArthur. You'll see a low-slung black building almost blending into the prairie. That is ExxonMobil. The employees have a nickname for that building, the Death Star. We went through 3 levels of security to get to the building itself. That's as much as it takes to get into the White House. And when we entered the first level, it was a little bit of a joke for Cece and some of the other people in there. I started playing the Mission Impossible theme, because that's what it felt like. I mean, we were like being scrutinized and watched and all this other stuff. When we finally made it to the lobby of the building, it was like being in the Omni Hotel in downtown Dallas. Very plush, very understated, but very empty. It was cold almost. There were no people. It was just, beauty for beauty's sake almost. We had our meeting, we thought it was a productive meeting, and then promptly hadn't heard anything from Exxon. But luckily, times changed. Just recently, earlier this summer, the president signed an executive order which will require federal contractors, and Exxon's one of them, to change their non-discrimination policies to include LGBT people. We're expecting that could happen as early as next month, but as late as probably next spring. We were able to get in there and make the case, and hopefully the case that we made will be part of the larger change in culture at that large company. Once again, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity of being able to speak here, and we'll now turn this back over to Robert.